This is Joe Peters from MomFit with Joe Peters. Welcome to the Spanglish World Network and the H.E.R Network on Single TV channels 250 and 251. Please remember to download the Single TV app in the respective iOS and Android devices. The app is free. While you are downloading, make sure to rate it and leave a comment. Single TV can also be found on Google Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Fire TV, Roku, and Roku Stick in all the smart TVs since 2016. And if you are not following me on social media yet, please go to Joe Unicorn Coach in Facebook, Instagram. I handle my social media handles personally. If you have any questions, challenges, issues around motherhood, let me know. And if I don't know the answer, I will find a guest expert like Tania that come to the show and help you because the mission of MomFit is help you to win the marathon of motherhood without burnout. Today, I'm super excited to be here with Tania. Tania helps moms and dads to take parenting challenges in their stride. She works with parents who are at their wits' ends because their children challenge them at every turn by refusing to listen to them and have regular meltdowns. Tanya loves to bring joy and fun back to the family. She does this through a combination of hypnotherapy and coaching so she can address both the conscious and unconscious processes at play. Tanya is an experienced and qualified teacher, counselor, and hypnotherapist, and has over 20 years of experience working with families. And today, Tanya is here in the show to talk about overcoming the feelings of failure, guilt, and shame that we as parents face, I will say, even every day. So, Tanya, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. I would love for you to start by telling us a little bit about your story on how you start working with families, how this become your passion, your mission, and who you are.
Thank you so much for having me on your show, Joe. Really a huge pleasure to be here. So, yes, I'm Tanya and I'm from Full Circle Parenting. And I've been working with families for about 2 decades now, more than 2 decades. And I got into it by working. So, I used to work for the local government. So, I used to work with whole families where there were issues. And then I started delivering our parenting programs about 15 years ago, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And while I was teaching parenting programs, I also qualified as a counselor. So I brought some of the counseling into my parenting work as well. And then a few years ago, I qualified as a hypnotherapist. And I really felt like that was the missing piece because with the hypnotherapy, I feel like I can. It brings in all the unconscious processes that a lot of us just aren't aware of that impact our interactions with children and that really have a huge impact on parenting. So I feel like with the teaching, counseling, and hypnotherapy, I decided to make that into my own business and work with mums and dads who are really struggling with their children's behavior. And some of the things that have always come up in every single course I've run is I feel like a failure, or I am a failure, or I have so much guilt and I feel so ashamed that I'm parenting like this. So those emotions, which are really tricky, big emotions, come up in every course that I run.
That is fantastic. And I think that that is a great inclusion to start talking about your phrase. I ask my guests to give me their favorite phrase. And your phrase is, I love curiosity before conclusion. Let's gonna talk a little bit about what that phrase mean to you and why do you pick that?
Yeah, yeah, I do love that phrase. And it's because quite often people sit in pure judgment of themselves. So they will say things like, I'm a bad parent, or I'm a failure. And so they sit in that conclusion and they just feel worse and worse. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we go into the topic of today. So we tend to ask questions like, why aren't I doing better? Why is it always me who gets it wrong? And we're really kind of asking very critical questions that criticize us and make us feel worse. Whereas if you move away from conclusions and judgments, you're just sitting in a space of curiosity. And curiosity is really beautiful because it brings about possibilities, it brings about new perspectives, new insights that we don't have if we just stick to our conclusion. So it's just really sitting in that space of being open, being judgment free, and just allowing our curiosity to lead us to, find really interesting answers rather than a conclusion that's negative and solid and that can't be moved.
I love that. And I was actually thinking that that concept of curiosity before conclusion apply also to our children, right? Because I can also see it a lot when they say, oh, he's just a trouble kid. He is just manipulating. So that parents and grandparents tend to also jump into conclusions around their kids' behavior instead of what you are saying so powerful, being curious into, I wonder what is triggering this, what is behind this. So I love how you are seeing that that curiosity can apply to us as parents, but also on how we interact with our children and our relationship with them.
Absolutely, because once you make a conclusion about a child, again, it's fixed. Whereas if you stay in curiosity, I wonder what my child needs right now. I wonder what the missing pieces here that I can help them with. And it helps you kind of evolve the way you think about your child. So it's less about, again, blaming and shaming and just being about really open, again, to new possibilities, how you can help your child from a very different curious place than if you come from a place of, oh, I know this is how he is. I know why she's doing this.
Yeah, perfect. Now I was gonna be talking about the first one that you said, and is I think that we all, at one point or another, feel like a failure with our children, either because early on the process, we are having struggles with breastfeeding, or our children are not sleeping as long as everybody in social media says, so we start thinking, what is wrong with me? Or when they start growing up, when they are not meeting our expectation and what we are expecting from them. And or that I think that I was talking with another guest about this, when our own trauma from our childhood show up in our relationship with them, all of these times are triggers for us as parents to feel like a failure. So let's gonna talk a little bit about that, parents feeling as a failure, and how we can overcome those feelings of failure.
Yes. Is that all right, Joe? Before I move on to talk about failure, just to set the context around conscious parenting,
Yes,
would that
please.
be okay? So before I actually talk about conscious parenting, it's what exactly is conscious parenting? And in order to answer this, I really want to look at unconscious parenting and something I've come across all the time, which is self-conscious parenting. So unconscious parenting is where a bit like what you've just mentioned, that we have all these triggers that are happening, um, and we don't know where they're coming from. We're unaware of our past programming, and we're unaware that our triggers are now impacting on our parenting relationship. And this can feel like a really powerless state because we don't feel a sense of internal control. And what can happen is that we end up blaming children, uh, I'm behaving this way because of the way my child, because of how my child is behaving and what they're doing. So that's unconscious parenting, is where we don't have the awareness of kind of what's happening in us that's impacting what's happening outside of us. And then the second type of parenting, which is self-conscious parenting, I've come across this all the time when I've been teaching my parenting programs. So self-conscious parenting is where we're super aware of other people's perceptions or perceived ideas and opinions about us. So it means that we feel constantly judged, and we feel that our parenting skills and our parenting decisions are being evaluated as good or bad by other people. And And what happens is when we're in the self-conscious mode, we then change what we would normally do because we want to please other people. So it means that we end up abandoning ourselves, which means that we end up abandoning our values, our principles, and we may even abandon our children. So rather than trying to meet their needs, we want to meet society's expectations. And of course, when we're in public places and our children are having a meltdown, it's super hard and it's super triggering. And we want to do everything we can to stop that meltdown. So we can quite easily go into fight, flight, and freeze mode because we don't want people to think badly about us. And I think with self conscious parenting, what we need to remember is that we're actually the story maker and the storyteller. We're only guessing as what people are thinking about us.
And that one, I want to interrupt you there because that
Yeah,
self
please.
consciousness is very important on not only society but also our families, like our extended family, like grandmas, grandpas. And then we start feeling that we are being evaluated, almost like we are back in school if we fail or pass the test of being a mom. I actually remember last year my baby was having a biting. My baby's 2 years and a half, so a biting time. And I remember feeling that self-conscious parenting to the point that I was worried about, like, oh my God, he I don't know where he learned this from, and it was not from my house. I remember, actually, now that you say it, I connected that was my self-conscious parenting. I even put in the group of the class a comment saying, I promise you he's not learning this from home. We are a loving, caring family. We are not aggressive. And is that almost like going back into like that shame or that fear of failing of our children being a representation of our worthy, of how much of a good job we are doing. So I love that on the self, and I cannot wait to go. So let's gonna keep going now. The conscious parenting.
Yeah, absolutely. So self-conscious parenting. So that leads us on to conscious parenting. Now, what I would say about conscious parenting is this is when we become aware or we strive to become aware of how our past programming is impacting on our current relationships, and especially when it comes to parenting. So I would say conscious parenting is not about being perfect. It's actually about being aware of what's not working between us and our children, and maybe what's not working within us. And it's about taking responsibility for that. So it's not about making yourself wrong, making your child wrong, or blaming external factors. Now, the unconscious parenting and self conscious parenting are both really powerless states. A bit like what you were just describing, Joe. You feel so powerless. You feel like you want to try and make it right. You want people to think well of you. So they can be quite powerless states. Whereas conscious parenting is exciting because that's where the possibility of change exists. And this helps us to parent the child in front of us um, rather than the expectations that have been placed on us due to our past programming. And like you said, due to extended families, due to society's expectations, and also due to, like complete strangers. And it's conscious parenting where we can start, interrupting those patterns that don't serve us. And hopefully we break them so they don't get passed on to our children. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a context around conscious parenting before we move on to the feelings of failure.
And I want to get your opinion there. I have a question there because we are in a society and a world that is a all or nothing. So I was thinking when you were talking that even if we make the choice to go into the conscious parenting path, that doesn't mean that at some situations or occasions we will jump back into the self-conscious parenting or the unconscious parenting. I think that is matter more of that journey of us making that choice that we're going to be working with you, and then going back into the failure, knowing that there are going to be times that we are going to jump to one or the other, and it's matter of us to in those moments stop and say, okay, I am in a self-conscious parenting position right now. How I regulate back into what I am consciously choosing to be the way that I raise my children. Is that correct? This is
I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. So in order to become more conscious as a parent, you have got to experience the self-conscious and the unconscious, because they will bring our attention to what needs to be, to the things that need to be resolved. So when we see ourselves in the self-conscious parenting, and so much of this happens automatically. It's not like, oh, I am choosing to be a self-conscious parent, I'm choosing to be unconscious. It's so automatic, that it really takes, we've got to really bring compassion into this. And it's only through compassion that we can move from unconscious and self-conscious to more conscious and compassionate parenting. And really, like I was saying, conscious parenting is really about reparenting yourself. So it's not just about parenting the child in front of you, it's about reparenting the child inside of you. And the way to reparent that child inside of you is through compassion, and maybe some of the things that might have been missing when we were growing up. So you're absolutely right. The conscious parenting isn't like, oh, I'm on this path of conscious parenting, that's it. It's going to be like a zigzagging. And actually, the beauty of self-conscious parenting and unconscious parenting is they will open our eyes.
perfect. Now, so I think that we are now just excited and ready to start going into this topic, because I also believe that as more we choose the conscious parenting path, as more aware we are of those feelings of failure, guilt, and shame. So let's gonna start talking with what are those feelings of failure? What is that feeling of failure? Where it begins with, and how we can overcome that, and why it's actually not helpful at all to let us go into that spiral of that feelings of failure.
Yeah. So yeah, all really good points there, Joe. So why does it feel so bad when we fail? And usually, as an adult, when we're failing at something, it usually reminds us of a past hurt or a past experience when we failed at something and we were made to feel like we were not enough or we were not good enough. And those feelings of not feeling good enough, not feeling enough, really lodge into us from when we are children. So that every time as an adult something doesn't go quite right, something goes wrong, all of those feelings are reignited and come to the surface. And so it's really painful when we feel like we're failing. And what what I would say is, in order to overcome feelings of failure, um, what can happen is that we feel that we should be doing things differently, maybe from our parents. And when things are going well, it's quite easy to do things differently from our parents. But when things are difficult and tricky, we might revert back to how we were parented, and we might see that as a mistake, and then we feel like we failed. And when this happens multiple times, we berate ourselves, because why am I doing the same thing again and again? I promised myself that I wouldn't do this, and now I'm doing it here yet again. And we often think that because I know better, I should do better. And I don't think that tells us the full story. So what I encourage people to do is, when they have these feelings of failure, is to start asking better questions. So rather than asking, why have I done this again? Why have I made the same mistake again? They're really kind of critical questions that we're asking. So instead of falling into that trap of beating ourselves up, it's asking better questions and smarter questions. So things like, is it okay for me to fail? And if it's not okay for me to fail, why isn't it okay? What's wrong? What is it about failing that's wrong? Does it say something about you? Do you make it personal? And if we think back to when we were toddlers, and if you watch a toddler learning to walk, they will fall down a million times. And you never see a toddler going, oh, I've fallen down again. That's it. I'm going to give up. I'm a failure. They keep getting up and they keep trying to walk. And it's because it's because they don't see failure as a full stop. A lot of people see failure as it's a full stop. That's it. Rather than seeing failure as the point at which growth, insight, and learning can happen. And what I would say is when we were children and we, at some point, as we were growing up, we were made to feel like we weren't good enough. We probably stopped learning to our full capacity and we stopped experimenting because in order to learn to our full capacity and in order to experiment, we have to make mistakes. We have to fail. And when we're afraid of failing, that kind of stops our learning. And what can happen is that we start associating failing with something concrete about us, that it says something about us, rather than thinking, actually, I'm struggling with this because it's new or because it's a difficult thing to master. And it's a process of learning. And what happens is we draw a conclusion, I am a failure. And especially when we think about parenting, children's phases and stages are always changing. So that means we're always learning something new, which means we're not going to get it right because your child will go through so many development stages and phases, and trying to keep up with it all can be really hard. So rather than making all these, big sweeping generalizations like I am a failure, which is what we were talking about before, Joe, about being in conclusion mode, it's about opening questions up. So things like, what did I learn about myself when that didn't go right? Is there something I could do differently next time? Can I take a different step? Can I take a smaller step? Can I take a step in a different direction? And then the next question is one that a lot of parents tell me that they struggle with, which is, can I ask for help? Now, when it comes to parenting, so many people feel like when they ask for help, it means that they're failing. But actually, asking for help is such a compassionate thing to do for yourself, because you don't have to do everything on your own. And especially when it comes to parenting, nobody's meant to be doing this on their own.
And I love that. And actually, when you were thinking, I laughed because that is exactly the same example that I put to my clients into when they are learning to walk, when they are learning to speak. You never. And then one other thing that I told them is not only them, but you as a parent never tell a baby, oh no, this walking thing is not for you. You know what? Just give up. Don't try anymore. You have been trying for 2 weeks. That is enough time. And then usually parents start laughing because they know that they will never say something like that to their children. They will say, it's okay, stand up again. But then we struggle having the same grace and kindness with ourselves. And then I was thinking, one of the things that I saw last year that I love around what fail means is fail is an acronym for first attempt in learning. That I love how you are connecting it into the question is, this failure is showing me that there is something that I am still not good at, I'm still not confident, so what I can learn. This was my first attempt on learning this situation. I love that. Let's going to talk a little bit about what are some of those situations where feelings of failure can be triggered and then we can get overwhelmed with them. What situations in the parent child relationship can be some of them that can hit this, thinking that there will be moms and parents watching the show that will need a little bit of that crumbled map to actually connect that triggering into, oh, that is why I'm feeling like this right now.
Yeah, so some of the situations where this will come up is a lot of parents tell me it's when it comes to shouting and yelling at their children. So quite often they'll say, do you know what? This is something I really want to stop doing with my child. I want to stop shouting at them. And so it's almost like they'll say, right, I'm going to stop doing this. And of course, like I was saying, our reactions are so automatic and they happen so quickly. Something will happen, you'll get triggered and you'll shout. And then what happens is parents then feel like, I really wanted to parent differently from the way my parents parented me, because they shouted all the time, they did all of this. And then when they are doing the same behaviors that they promised that they wouldn't do, and they're doing it, that's when the sense of failure can manifest itself. And then it's also when it happens multiple times. Every time you say to yourself, right, tomorrow's a new day, I'm not going to shout. And, within half an hour of the children waking up, they're shouting. And I think, the word that you used was kindness and grace. They're so important because they're the antidote, if you like, to the feelings of failure, and just saying, okay, um, yes, I've shouted again. It doesn't mean that I'm a failure. And I always say to people, whenever you feel that you've reached the point of failure, that's the bit that gives you the opportunity to learn and do something different. If you like, failure is a launch pad for growth, learning, and doing different things. But really, we've got to get this part about reparenting ourselves with compassion, kindness, and grace. And the saying I said before, a lot of people say to me, because I know better, I should do better. And I often say, knowing isn't enough. It's about the feeling. Because I feel better, I can now do better. So we really need to feel good in ourselves so we can start, I always say we need to change what's inside, and it will have an impact on the outside.
Absolutely. And I love that because you are, when you say that phrase at the first time, I thought about it. It's like, yeah, I can know consciously better, but if in my subconscious I still have a lot of triggers and trauma and all that, I'm not feeling better. So the triggers are going to keep coming. The other one that I will love your insight because it's something that I also think that society is being putting a lot of pressure is I think that we forget that children are children. And as more fast paced the society is going, as more the expectations of these children are getting higher and higher and higher and higher. And one of the things is when it's easy for us to take it personal when we are saying, oh, my child is giving me a hard time. And then we are, like you were saying with your phrase, we are concluding that they are purposely acting in a way that is triggering us. But instead of saying, oh, they are giving me a hard time, when we go into, oh, my child is having a hard time, then we can tap into that kindness and grace and unconditional motherhood love to say, oh, I don't want my child to have a hard time. So instead of making them be the person that is responsible and that they are doing it consciously, we actually get the compassion into, like you were saying, I want to understand, I want to be curious about why you're having a hard time and how I can help you versus why you don't stop doing what you are doing or why I cannot stop doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, now this is where I think some of the unconscious stuff, subconscious stuff comes in, because it can be quite triggering when your child is behaving in a way where you feel that you are having a hard time. You're having a hard time dealing with the behavior that your child is doing. Now, quite often, it's all very interesting, really. So, say, for example, you have a child who just doesn't listen to you, and that will be giving you a hard time because they're not listening to you. Now, what can happen is that when you were a child, nobody listened to you. You had to listen to everybody else, and you had to be the perfect listener. Otherwise, you would get punished. You know, generations ago, there were all kinds of punishments if you didn't do exactly what you were told straight away. So now, and you tried so hard to please your parents and be this really good listener and do what they ask you. And now you have a child who doesn't listen to you, doesn't do anything you ask. That's going to trigger the inner child in you that always listened to their parents, that always did everything, they tried to be the really good child. And now you've got a child here who doesn't care if they're not listening to you. And that's how we see it. And that's why we think they're giving me such a, well, I feel like I'm having such a hard time because nothing is easy. We're trying to get out the door. They won't do anything. Um, And so, one of the questions I always ask when I'm working with parents is, where in your own life do you not listen to yourself? And that just changes everything, because when parents realize, okay, there's so many of my own needs that I never listen to. I always put everybody else first. I never listen to my own needs. The promises I make to myself, I never listen to them. I ignore them. And what happens is, the way the world works, these things appear in our lives to wake us up. So a child not listening to you can be a bit of a wake up call to say, Mum, are you listening to yourself? Are you listening to your own needs? Are you listening to the promises you've made yourself? So, yeah, all of those things are really interesting, because we can only shift our perspective when we don't feel like we're being, that like we're not being crushed in this very hard time that we think our child is giving. And that's when we can change the perspective to, actually, my child has some needs, unmet needs here. And if I can meet those needs, then they will listen to me, and we can have better dynamics in our relationship.
And I love that, and love that the concept of having that connection and that understanding of listen to myself, and having that connection into they are showing us. The other thing that is fascinating to me is that, because we always get compared with other children, it's very easy, other children or our families are like, oh, you were not like that, or in my house that was not allowed. But then, as more we get studies on these things, we are understanding that the children actually can have the biggest emotions and the biggest reactions with the people that they feel the safest with. And that means that if they don't do it with the other parent or with the grandparents, really means that you were never feel safe to show your big emotions. So I love that concept too, because then allow me to, when my baby and when my clients are facing that, those big emotions and those tantrums and those things, then it's good to say, oh, almost like feeling good about it and celebrate and say, and this means that my baby feels safe enough with me to let this go out. I remember talking with a friend, and she is co-parenting with a narcissist, and the conversation was around uh, her kid went with the narcissist parent and was there like a week or something, and then came back, and then react really bad around her and her family, and had really big feelings, and she was getting very triggered about that, until I told her, so like, do you realize that is because she spent a week not be feeling safe and showing her emotions and how she really feels, because she's on that house under a narcissist behavior. So when she come to your house, then she finally feels safe. So that is important to mention.
Absolutely, because I think, yes, you've basically hit the nail on the head there, Joe. With your friend's daughter has spent a week suppressing who she is, and it's awful. It's got to, those feelings have got to come out, and so the best way for them to come out is with her mum, because that's where, like you said, she feels safe to let those out. And when our children are having those big emotions or not listening to us, and when our parents are saying, well, you were never like that, it's because we suppressed those parts of us when we were with our own parents, because we wanted to make them happy, we wanted for them to not get angry with us. So those parts are suppressed in us, which is why it can be so triggering when our suppressed parts now show up in our children. And what we want to do, the urge is to suppress them, because we were so good at suppressing ours. And the conscious parenting is about, how do I meet my own needs and also meet the needs of my child? And that's the really tricky dynamic that you're playing around with.
Good. I love it. Now let's gonna be talking a little bit about guilt and the difference between failure and guilt, and then also how we can overcome those feelings of guilt that as parents we may start feeling after we see a result or something happening with our children.
Yeah. Joe, is it okay if I talk about shame first and then I'll come to guilt
Absolutely.
later?
Absolutely. Let's talk about shame.
Failure and shame are so, and all three of them are intertwined, but shame fits in so nicely at this point because, like we were saying, that when people, when they feel like they've failed again and again, they start feeling shame because they feel like they should be doing a lot better. Now, shame is really quite personal. Um, Shame is about who we are, a label that we give ourselves. So, for example, I'm a bad parent or I'm a bad person. So, probably our first experience of shame was in childhood. There was probably a childhood incident where we felt embarrassed or we felt ashamed, and that's really left a mark. Maybe you spoke up and everybody laughed at you, or you tried something and you failed and everybody laughed at you for even trying. And the feeling of shame can be really terrifying. um, and we go over things in our heads over and over again, especially the feeling of shame, and it can become really embedded. And shame forces us to keep secrets. Now, you're probably aware of Brene Brown,
Yeah.
and she talks a lot about shame. She has some great TED talks on shame and the whole topic, so that's really worth watching. What I would say about shame, and this is where I talk about reparenting ourselves. So, again, shame is going to be another automatic emotion that comes up. And the best way to deal with shame, a really helpful way to deal with shame, is to take an observer position. So, when you're starting to feel the shame, imagine that there's an observer watching you and they're just noticing the part in you wherever you feel the shame. So it's really important that we don't try and deny the feeling or suppress the feeling of shame. Just notice the shame and be with it. Now, imagine that this observer is the kindest, the most loving person either in real life or they could be a character in a film or a book. Now, how would they speak to this part of you that's feeling shame? I'm kind of pointing here because shame is, kind of, we might feel it in our stomach, we might feel it around our chest. So, how would they speak to this part of you that's feeling the shame? So, imagine the most compassionate conversation. So, this observer is, completely non judgmental. So, even when you're sitting in judgment of yourself, this objective, compassionate observer doesn't judge you, and they just offer you unconditional love, and nothing you will do will make them withdraw their love from you. They know that you are doing your best, and they know that anything that you did isn't doesn't say anything personal about you, the human being. It's just a moment in time, and it will pass. So if you can allow the love of this observer, this presence, to flow through your body and reach the parts of you where you feel the feeling of shame, and let that feeling of love envelope the parts of you. And this is how we start to reparent ourselves. So we give ourselves maybe something that was missing when we were children.
I love that. And that is a very strong emotion, right? Because that shame will go directly into that reptile brain fear of being excluded and isolated. Because I am ashamed of this, and then afraid of that shame is how the society and community around me are going to react. Because back then, millions of years ago, if we were excluded from our community, we will die. So that
Yeah.
reptile brain still have that survival fear that can hit a lot into that shame. It's going to talk a little bit about how that shame can show up in our parenting, and how that shame can affect our relationship with our children in our parenting relationship.
Yeah, so one of the things I would say, and I think I've already mentioned this, is that shame makes us really secretive and it stops us from asking for help. because we don't want to admit, because we're ashamed for, that we have to ask for help. So that's why failure and shame go so hand in hand, because we feel like we're failing if we ask for help. And then if we ask for help, we feel ashamed that we've had to ask for help. And the way this can show up in our parenting relationship is that we might try and stop children from doing things because we don't want them to experience embarrassment. We don't want to we don't want them to experience shame. We don't want them to experience failure. So we might always be putting boundaries around them and trying to keep them safe. But then what we're doing is we're maybe stopping them from experiencing growth. We're stopping them from experiencing failure. And yeah, we're doing everything we can to protect them. And that limits the growth that children might have. And I suppose really what I would say is the process that I just described, which was reparenting ourselves, it's if we can reparent ourselves, then we can allow ourselves to be there for our children. So when they are experiencing any of those big emotions, we can just let them know that no matter what they've done, we're still there giving them unconditional love. We're still their cheerleaders. We're still there not to just judge them. We know that maybe they did something, and it's letting them know that was a moment in time. That doesn't make that into a character. That doesn't say something personal about you.
I love that. And it's important what you were saying into that beautiful, because that is something that the reality is nobody teaches that when we become parents, it's a double job, because it's parenting our children but also reparenting that inner child that had all these fears and emotions and traumas that, like you were saying, are being pushed down for decades. And go ahead.
Yeah. No, absolutely. What you're saying is absolutely right, Joe. That, when we were growing up, when we were children, and then you become an adult, there's no blueprint. There's no role model who showed us how to do this. So you almost have to create your own um, blueprint for how you're going to do this. How are you going to map out a very different path for your child that maybe you didn't have? And as you're mapping out this path for your child, you're also reparenting your own path out of judgment, out of failure, out of shame, and out of guilt. Yeah, so all of those two things are playing at the same time. And as I'm saying it, I'm thinking what an exhausting job it is, that not only are you doing it for your child, you're doing it for yourself. And and I would say for anybody who's doing this, it is brave work. And the first thing is, so you don't get exhausted and you don't get burnt out, is to go softly, gently, and compassionately with yourself. So it's not about, oh yeah, I've learned this, I now need to put this into practice. Tomorrow, that's it, I'm going to start, I'm going to be doing it. It's any mistakes that you make, anything that you feel that you failed, use those to kind of raise your awareness and give those things your attention first. Bring compassion and kindness and grace to those things, rather than just thinking, I need to parent in this way. The first job is to gently reparent yourself, and that will have an impact on the way that you parent your child. Because what a lot of people do is they'll say, no, I'm going to start doing this with my child, and then what they do is they go into suppression, denial about their own feelings, and then they're completely burnt out.
Absolutely. And now let's gonna touch us as it was absolutely amazing. We are getting closer to the end of the show. Let's gonna talk a little bit about guilt as well. The third one on our feelings that are not useful in our conscious parenting journey.
Yeah. So now guilt is a bit different from shame in that it's not as personal. So guilt is feeling bad about maybe something that we did, an action that we did. So we label our actions. And actually guilt is taught to us from a really young age. When we've done something that an adult didn't approve of, they they have taught us how to feel guilt. And I would say guilt is a bit of a national sport when it comes to parenting. Most people feel guilty, even about things that they're not responsible for, that that are outside of their control. Um, and so, yeah, so guilt is like, it's an emotion that is universal. Now, the thing with guilt is that guilt allows us to put things right. So we can say sorry, like quite often when we rupture a relationship, we can also repair it by saying sorry, we can make amends, we can take responsibility for our own part in that. So in that respect, it's good. And but when it comes to children and we're feeling guilty, what can often happen is that we overcompensate. So say, for example, we've shouted at our child and then later on we're feeling guilty. We might give them a treat or we might give them extra time on a computer game. So basically what we're doing is we're rewarding them for our behavior, which we've labeled as bad. And it's a really natural instinct to overcompensate because we we want our relations to be good with our children, and we don't want them to think that we don't love them or we don't like them. So overcompensation can lead to very tricky power dynamics, um, and children can get very confused because the power has almost shifted onto them. And I'm a big advocate for sharing power with children, but the power imbalance that rises out of guilt is really it's unhealthy. So one way of dealing with guilt is using the same process that I described for shame, which is having this really compassionate observer who witnesses as you're feeling the guilt. Now, another way of tackling guilt, and this is something that lots of parents say to me that they find really challenging, it's to actually not overcompensate. And that's not to say that you can't talk to your children about what happened and that you can't say sorry, but it's the actual actions that you take that are to do with overcompensation. So if you can, it's to stop yourself from overcompensating and really allow yourself to feel the guilt, which is something that, parents say they find really challenging. And again, get curious. So ask better questions. So you can ask questions like, what was it that I needed in the moment, before I shouted, or whichever behavior that's led you to feel guilty? What did you need in the moments before you reached that point where you shouted or did a particular behavior? And this question can be very, tricky for parents because it's about how well are you taking care of your own needs? And so much comes up for parents when we talk about how are you meeting your own needs? And then also think about, is this a pattern? So maybe the shouting or maybe giving bribes or threats, is this a pattern that you've fallen into? And can this pattern be interrupted? And then the next question is the same question that I asked for feelings of failure, which is, can I ask for help? Can I ask for support? And then also, if when it comes to feelings of guilt, when it comes to our children, we can also ask, what did my child need before that moment when I shouted? Or in that moment when we saw the behavior that we didn't like? And is it possible to meet both my child's needs and meet my own needs? Now, I can totally understand why people overcompensate because it's a way to make ourselves feel better, and also it can make our children feel better as well. So the only thing with overcompensating is that we miss the chance of making changes. So when we sit with our guilt and we ask those questions, then we can start introducing some, some different, newer, conscious behaviors, because those questions lead us into consciously changing our behaviors, whereas overcompensating is a automatic and natural reaction because we want to improve um, and start to feel better because of what we did.
I love that. Love that. Tania, thank you so much for being in the show today. Before we go, can you please share with the audience how they can reach out to you if they want to ask for help and learn a little bit more about your full cycle parenting?
Yes, so my website is www.fullcircleparenting. So that's FULLCIRCLE parenting.co.uk. So I am in the UK. So you can have a look at my website. I'm also on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Facebook as well. And my handles are all Full Circle Hypnotherapy.
Okay, thank you so much, Tania. It was a pleasure. Please go and connect with Tania, reach out to her, and let's gonna make a conscious decision to choose to parent in a way that is good for us and good for our children. Thank you so much. Please note that this show can also be heard at the Spanglish Radio Network. Please check out www.spanglishworld.ca for all the news and programming. Spanglish World. Watch it, hear it, read it, download it, and leave it.
Thank you so much for having me